Time did not simply flow like water. Sometimes it thickened. Sometimes it paused. Sometimes it sank into the shadow of a stone, or halted in the silence of a freshly dug grave. In the year 1347, a darkness quietly crept into the veins of Europe. It did not only decay bodies, it withered belief, eroded cities, and unraveled memory. When the Black Death arrived, no one dared speak its name. At first, it was a whisper, a hushed fear murmured at the well, a glance exchanged near the chapel wall. Then, it became a prayer, and finally, a bell. The bells rang so often that no one remembered who they mourned anymore. Streets emptied. Only the wind wandered the village square. Doors of monasteries were bolted from the inside. Some chose to stay within. Some were left outside. Some prayed. Some simply went quiet. For years, every stone, every wall, every crack, and floorboard bore silent witness to the unspoken, the unwept, the unburied. This is not the story of buried bodies. This is the story of memories left to fade into the soil. And we are here to listen again, gently, quietly, never loudly. These stories are not told by shouting. They come as whispers. Here, you will not find heroes. There are no victories, no redemption arcs. Here, there's a mother's whispered lullaby, a boy's final glance as he clutches the bell's rope, a monk locking the door from the inside, a woman trying to burn away her memories with bitter smoke. These are not headline stories. They live in the margins. They were forgotten between lines. This is the Plague Diaries. And if you've stepped into this world, if you can hear the voice that drifts through silence, if you feel like a breath trapped beneath a stone, leave a like. Because these stories live again when someone listens. They awaken with you. Subscribe. Because this journey doesn't begin with a single voice. Because silence, when shared, becomes story. And we choose not to shout it, but to let the silence speak. And please, leave a comment. Because perhaps your words will carry the voice of someone long lost. Some were never named, but their stories may be hidden in your sentence. Now, hold your breath. But don't worry. What we're about to share is not breathtaking. It's the story of those who lived without breath, carried by wind, forgotten by bells, woven into the ground. Prepare yourself. We've already started to listen. Time did not simply flow like water. It hesitated, lingered in corners, pressed itself into the grain of wood and the cracks between stones. It crept along the edges of morning fog, settled in the folds of linen curtains, and disappeared into the sighs of those who no longer dreamed. Sometimes it thickened like honey in the cold. Sometimes it paused entirely, wrapped around silence like a forgotten prayer. In the year 1347, a quiet darkness began to seep through Europe's veins, not with thunder, but with whispers. Not with war cries, but with coughs behind closed shutters. It did not storm through gates with armies, but filtered into homes with the breath of a stranger. This darkness did not only decay flesh, it unraveled memory, dissolved certainty, and hollowed faith. It stole the rhythm of bells and replaced them with dread. The Black Death did not come with a name. It arrived in glances, in rumors, in candles burning longer than they should. It was first a whisper, a mother glancing toward a fevered child, a priest tightening his grip on the incense burner, a silence between two sisters folding linen by the river. And then, it became a prayer, passed from mouth to mouth, repeated not in hope but in habit. When that failed, when the dead outnumbered the living, it became a bell. Not the clean, bright ring of celebration, but a dull, fractured chime that echoed with fatigue. The bells rang so often that people forgot who they mourned. Each ring folded into the next. Streets emptied, markets faded into dust. The clatter of carts was replaced by the hum of flies. Doors were sealed with ash and wax, windows covered with cloth soaked in vinegar. In one village, people hung flowers above doorways, believing rosemary might keep death at bay. It didn't. In another, they fled to the forest, hoping trees would shelter them. They didn't. Monasteries barred their doors. Monks whispered psalms through walls as though afraid their voices might invite the plague in. Some chose to stay. Inside, watching candle wax melt into oblivion. Others, left behind, wandered aimlessly, their eyes seeking answers in empty chapels. And still, some prayed. Others simply grew silent. Over the years, every stone, every beam, every rafter became a witness. They held stories of those who no longer had names. The whisper of a girl brushing her mother's hair before sleep. The thud of a book dropped by a scholar who never stood again. The final cough of a child whose only sin was breathing. This is not the story of empires or kings. It is not a chronicle of heroes. This is not a tale of triumph. This is the story of forgotten lives. Of those who were folded into soil, not with ceremony, but with resignation. Of those who became part of the wind, the dust, the silence between. Bells, and we centuries later are here to listen, gently, without drama, without spectacle, because stories like these do not shout. They do not demand, they whisper. And if you listen closely enough, in the hush between words, you may hear them. You will not find legends here. You will find a woman humming to know. One as she boils water for the last time. A child gripping the bell rope with a strength far beyond his years. A priest pressing his hand against a sealed door, whispering a final blessing to those he cannot save. A healer burning herbs, hoping to chase away a shadow that cannot be touched. These are not headlines. These are not tales carved into marble. These are memories that lived in wooden walls, in woven cloth, in empty spoons. This is the plague. Diaries. And if you have found your way here, if you felt the hush in your own bones, then stay. Let the silence settle. Let the dust rise. Leave a like, not out of habit, but as a small gesture of remembrance. Subscribe not for updates, but because voices like these are never heard alone. And please, leave a comment, because perhaps your words, your quiet sentence might carry the voice of someone who no longer has one. Some were buried without names, some were lost without stories, but perhaps, through you, they will be remembered. So now hold your breath, not in fear, but in reverence, because what we share is not meant to astonish, it is not thrilling. It is the story of those who could no longer speak, carried by wind, forgotten by bells, rooted in stone and soil. Be still, we have already begun to listen. Sometimes a line doesn't save lives, it only delays sorrow. The wall built around the small stone village of Elmsbrook was one such line, not a boundary of protection, but of desperation. Nestled between three forgotten mountains, Elmsbrook was not marked on most maps. It was a village of clay ovens, slate roofs, and quiet winters. In the spring of 1348, whispers came, first rumors of sickness drifting from the south, tales of cities gone silent, of entire parishes left unblessed. First it was talk in the tavern, then it was a prayer muttered before sleep, and finally it became stone. The villagers decided to build a wall, not for beauty, not for pride, but for survival. Women carried rocks until their shoulders bled. Men stacked them with trembling hands. Children didn't play. They gathered moss to fill the cracks. Each stone placed was a fear buried in silence. When it was done, a ring of gray wrapped the village like a clenched fist. And the eldest among them, a man whose voice had outlived 2 plagues, said, "This wall is the last barrier between God and death." But even then, no one could say which side God was on. A gate was built sturdy, bolted, and guarded. Only one man would be allowed to pass through it. His name was Reinhard, strong, tall, silent. He knew the paths through the forest. He spoke little, but his hands carried bread, herbs, salt ink, medicine, and rumor. Each time he left, hope followed. Each time he returned, fear returned with him, because no one ever knew what might cling to the hem of his cloak. One morning, a child appeared at the northern gate barefoot, filthy, eyes like dried tears. He did not speak. He did not knock. He just looked at the wall, as if hoping it would move on its own. The villagers watched in silence. To see a child outside the wall was to feel your soul tear in two. But no one opened the gate. The elders prayed. The women wept. But the gate did not move. The boy stayed for days. Then one morning, he was gone. No one asked what happened. No one spoke his name. Because in those days, even asking was dangerous. Reinhard did not return one night. And the next day, something else entered the village, not on foot, but in breath. A slow, wet cough. First one home, then another, then another. By dusk, the fever had arrived. By dawn, the fear. The wall had held the outside world at bay. But the sickness was already inside. The disease had not climbed over the stones. It had grown inside them. And the wall, once a shield, became a prison. Doors were barred from the inside. Families no longer looked out their windows. The silence that had once kept the village safe now pressed against every doorframe like a second skin. The air turned heavy. The animals grew still. The trees, once full of birdsong, seemed to lean away from the village. No one rang the bell anymore. There were no hands left to pull the rope. A week later, the northern gate creaked open, not by hands, but by wind. The latch broke. The hinges gave way. The door swung slowly. And no one walked out, and no one walked in. Elmsbrock disappeared not in fire, not in screams, but in stillness. The kind of stillness that makes your breath feel loud. The kind that turns memories into myth. It was never written in history. It was not spoken of in sermons. It slipped away like a name forgotten in a dream. Only the wall remained. Stones stacked upon stones, leaning into each other, holding nothing but air, because some walls are not built to protect. Some are built to bury. That morning, the village bell rang not for mourning, but for joy. For the first time in months, perhaps even years, the air in the stone village of Eberthal carried laughter instead of fear. The plague had not yet reached their doors, and for a brief, fragile moment, life dared to continue. A woman in white descended the chapel steps, her dress trailing behind her like a memory in motion. On her head was a crown of fresh meadow flowers, wild and humble. The dew of morning clung to the hem of her gown, shimmering in the pale sunlight. Her eyes held a kind of reckless hope, the kind that blooms only in those who still believe in beginnings. Her name was Matilda. She was 23. Her hands always smelled faintly of soapwort. Her face, villagers would later say, was like the last note of a lullaby, soft, sweet, and too fleeting. Beside her walked Elias, her childhood love. They had grown up side by side, sharing riverbanks and apple slices, dreams whispered beneath quilts. Their marriage had been postponed again and again, first by famine, then by sickness, then by another poor harvest. But that day, finally, they said yes. The wedding was small, but tender. There were no drums, but the wind sang through the trees in their honor. There were few guests, but many smiles. Matilda did not dance. She simply sat beneath a tree, looking skyward, and whispered a silent prayer. In that time, too much joy was seen as dangerous, an invitation for fate to intervene. 3 days after the wedding, Matilda fell ill. That first night, she trembled. The second, she spoke no words. On the third, she looked into Elias's eyes and whispered, "Please, don't remember me." The flower crown wilted beside her bed. The dew on her dress was replaced by fevered sweat. The soft scent of soapwort gave way to the bitter metallic sting of dying breath. Elias tried everything: prayers, incense, old recipes, his mother once murmured. But the plague, once it kissed you, never kissed you twice. On the fourth day, Matilda fell silent. On the fifth, her eyes did not close. On the sixth, the village bell rang again, but this time, no one smiled. Elias did not bury her. Instead, he built a room of stone, alone. He did not return to church. He stopped speaking to the villagers. He took her wedding dress and each night knelt on the cold floor of that room. He placed the gown over his head like a shroud. As if mourning wasn't enough, he wanted to become the grave. No one saw Elias by daylight again. But at night, some claimed they saw a figure leaning against the church walls, holding a dress, his feet caked in mud, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the stars. Matilda's story ended there. But the legend of the Black Bride began. In that village, they say, if a girl is to be married, the morning dew must kiss the edge of her dress. If it doesn't, the wedding is postponed, because the Black Bride still watches, still waits, still grieves, and some bells are never meant to ring for joy again. The bell rang once in the morning, then again at noon, and by evening, a third time. On that day, 3 graves were opened in the soft, trembling soil behind the chapel. The next day, the bell rang 4 times. The day after that, 5. And within a week, the bell no longer marked time by the sun, but by breath each toll an echo of one soul slipping quietly away. The one who rang the bell was not a priest, not a monk, not a man of age or wisdom. It was a boy. His name was Lucas, 12 years old, small, wiry, quiet. He had memorized every stone of the spiral staircase that led to the bell tower. He knew which steps creaked, which ones were colder, which ones whispered his name when his feet brushed past. In the beginning, he helped. He carried messages to the monks. He polished the brass. He stood beside the older bell ringer and watched how the rope pulled life into the air. But then the plague took the old ones first, then the priests, then the ones who still prayed. And soon, there was no one left to ring the bell but Lucas. Each morning, he climbed the stairs. Each night, he returned to silence. At first, he rang the bell with strength. The sound stretched across the hills, bounced off the stone walls of the valley, and reminded everyone that they were still seen, still counted. But as the days passed, his arms grew weak. His hands blistered, his shoulders burned, and the sound became quieter, more fragile, like a heartbeat losing rhythm. He began to ring the bell for names he no longer recognized. Each pull of the rope felt heavier, less like lifting sound into the sky, and more like dragging sorrow from the earth. Then one morning, he didn't ring it at all. The village fell into silence. For a moment, people dared to believe. Maybe it's over, they whispered. But Lucas had not forgotten. He had simply fallen asleep on the tower stairs, hungry, exhausted, voiceless. Because the bell no longer announced death, it became death. The next day, he returned to his post, but the sound had changed. It was no longer even. It rang like grief that's uneven, tired, cracking under its own weight. One day, someone whispered his mother's name. The next, his father's. And then one morning, his little sister. That day, the bell rang, but not like before. Short, trembling bursts. Offbeat, like a cry trapped inside a stone. That night, Lucas sat alone in the tower. He looked at the sky. His eyes were full, but he did not cry, because bell ringers do not cry. Their tears are made of metal and echo. The morning after, the bell rang again. But this time, it rang long, too long, until it stopped altogether. And when the villagers looked up, they saw a small body hanging gently from the bell rope, 1 foot bare, one eye half closed, and a face that carried not pain, but a quiet kind of peace, like someone who had finally found silence. The village never heard the bell again. Not for death, not for birth, not for weddings, not even for prayer. Because some sounds, when echoed too many times, become a weight that no one can carry. and Lucas's echo still lingers in the cold stone of that tower. A city is not just made of stone and timber. It is built from the voices trapped between alley walls, from the faded warmth behind locked doors, from the long stretches of silence interrupted only by the murmur of wind brushing past broken shutters. And when the people are gone, the city does not die at once. It exhales, slowly, as if releasing the breath it had held for centuries. This story is about what lingers in that breath. The city was called Marinsfeld. Once, it thrived at the crossroads of trade routes, its stone markets bustling, its churches echoing with choirs, its alleys filled with the smell of bread and coal and freshly spilled wine. Before the plague came, vendors called out in every dialect. The sound of children wove through the arches, and laughter could be heard even at dusk. But then, the sounds vanished. First, the distant bells stopped. Then, the smoke from chimneys faded. Finally, the marketplace stood still, abandoned, as though time itself had left. People prayed, then they fled. Some carried their children, others only their gold, and some left behind their names. Among the stone, one man remained, Brother Ewald, a monk of quiet discipline. He had not spoken in years. He wrote everything: his thoughts, his prayers, his confessions. While others escaped, he stayed. Because, he believed, a servant of God does not flee. His prayer, he thought, should not echo only within walls. And so, as days turned into weeks, the city fell silent. Streets once alive with footsteps became corridors of wind. There were no children peeking through windows, no laughter, no arguments, just Ewald and the echo of absence. But loneliness did not arrive quietly. It came first with footsteps, soft, steady, deliberate, echoing through the cobbled lanes at night. He looked from the tower window and saw no one. The next night there were whispers. Not Latin, not prayer, but something circular, like a forgotten lullaby. Then, on the third night, a knock, 3 taps at the monastery door. There was no iron knocker, only the brittle sound of a bony hand. Ewald did not open it, but he prayed, and the sound ceased. Yet the shadows stayed. By day he walked the city. The bakeries smelled of mold, their ovens cold. Apples rotted in market stalls, forgotten. Flies buzzed where once silver had clinked. At the old fountain, water still ran. But when he looked into its surface, he did not see himself. Behind him, someone else. He turned. Nothing. But his heart knew. He was not alone. Not anymore. The bodies may have gone, but the shadows had not left the walls. Each night, the sounds grew louder. Footsteps, children's laughter, a figure. Behind a curtain, the church bell rang without hands. He wrote in his journal, "Is it I who remain, or is it they who never left?" One morning, he entered the chapel. The altar was bare. Scripture scattered, candles snuffed. Yet he knelt, began to pray. And from behind him, a voice, dry, soft, cracking like paper. "We are listening." He did not turn. He closed his eyes and whispered his prayer. In the following days, he stopped writing, stopped speaking. He walked instead through each alley, touched every stone, greeted each shadow like an old friend. Sometimes he smiled, sometimes he wept. One morning they found him in the monastery courtyard, seated, back against the wall, eyes open yet distant. And on his face, not fear, peace. His journal lay beside him. Its last page read, "I thought the city would fall silent once the bodies were gone. But the loudest voice is silence." Shadows are not just the echo of light. They are the imprint of memory, and I listened. Marinsfeld was never repopulated. But when travelers pass the ruins, the wind stirs differently. Doors creak as though opening. And from the broken windows, sometimes, just sometimes, a shadow lingers, because some cities do not fall, they fade. into whispers, into walls, into memory. Not all homes are meant for living. Some are built for hiding, for remembering, or sometimes for protecting. On the edge of a small forgotten village stood a half-collapsed stone house. Its roof sagged, its chimney broken, but beneath it, the ground remained firm. Years ago, a cellar had been dug meant for storing coal, damp, cold, and lightless. And when the sickness approached, one man turned that room into a final refuge. His name was Martin. A mason, a quiet father of 3, he had not fought in wars. He had never been praised from a pulpit. But to save his family, he worked harder than most saints. As rumors of plague neared the village, Martin acted. He sealed his doors, boarded the windows. Then, with trembling hands, led his wife and children beneath the earth. Just a few days, he told them. When it passes, we'll see the sun together. At first, silence was a comfort. Oil lamps glowed. Stories were whispered. The children believed their father. The wife clung to her prayers. And Martin climbed the stairs each night. Just before he left, he always said the same thing. I'll be back. But the world above was changing. Neighbors no longer greeted one another. The small church had long closed. No more laughter in the square, only coughs, wheezes, and the dull scrape of shovels through soil. Gravediggers no longer waited for dawn. Martin brought food each morning. But the stories stopped. His voice thinned. His hands began to shake. One morning, his eyes were red. His wife noticed. Said nothing, only lowered her gaze. Martin said nothing either. That night, the lamp burned longer, and the door. He didn't shut it fully. As he climbed the stone steps, he turned once. The children waved. His wife did not cry. It wasn't goodbye. It was remembering. The next day, he didn't return. The door stayed shut. No sound above. One day passed, then 2, then 3. On the 4th, the wife climbed the stairs. Martin wasn't there. The door was open, the house silent, no note, no sign. But on the windowsill, she found a single carved stone bird. A small figurine Martin had shaped years ago for their children. And she understood. He had left, quietly, without a touch. Without goodbye. To save them, he had erased himself. That night, she told the children a new story. That their father had become a bird of stone, watching from the sky. That he sent messages through the wind. And if they listened closely, they might hear his heartbeat echoing through the walls. The children smiled. She wept, quietly. They stayed in the room for weeks, until the sickness passed. When the world returned, those who survived found the house still standing, its door shut, but in the window, the stone bird remained. Some fathers are never remembered. Their names fade, but some stones carry whispers longer than any name. Some people are born with clean hands. Others, like Jonas, are born into the soil not to plant, not to build, but to dig, to bury, to cover what no longer breathes. Jonas was a gravedigger. He had never been anything else. He saw no war, no king, no miracle, just the shovel, the stone, the silence. When the plague came, his work multiplied. In one village alone, he dug 3 graves a day. Then 5, then 10. The village graveyard filled quickly. So Jonas moved to the hills. Death, it seemed, had no concern for boundaries or maps. As the days passed, the faces he buried became harder to remember. His hands ached, his eyes blurred. The smell of the earth became part of his breath. Every grave was the same, one weight, one depth, one stillness. But one day, he heard something, a sound from within a grave. At first, just a murmur. Then, a faint ring as if the bones were speaking from beneath the soil. He told himself. It was nothing, just fatigue. Dig enough graves, he muttered, and the ground starts talking back. But the voices didn't stop. In fact, they multiplied. Every night, Jonas heard the people he had buried, their words, their prayers, their songs. A woman whispered lullabies. A child cried out for their mother. A man simply said his name, Jonas. He was no longer digging graves, he was burying stories. And before every burial, he heard the faint echo of a bell. But the boy who rang the bell had died weeks ago. Sleep became impossible. The days and nights blurred into one. Only dirt, only stone, only voices. One morning, he stepped into an open grave he had prepared, not to bury, but to listen. He smoothed the sides with his hands, kneeled, pressed his ear to the soil. For a long time there was silence. Then, a woman's voice whispered softly, "Remember me, Jonas." My eyes were blue. He sat up. He did not cry. He only smiled and placed a small stone at the grave's head. The next day, he dug no graves. He walked from one to another, leaving small stones atop each. They had no names now, but they had voices. And Jonas had heard them all. Days later, he vanished. His shovel was found, but he was not. The villagers did not believe he had died. Some say he still walks beneath the soil, quietly, and sometimes when night falls, a shadow can be seen kneeling near a fresh grave, gently touching the stones. Because some people don't just bury bodies. They bury memories, and memories never fully go silent. In some villages, prayer is a gentle murmur, but in others, it becomes a shout, and if that shout echoes far enough, it burns someone alive. The village was called Brackenfeld, nestled between mountains with only one entrance and one exit. Its people lived by their own fields, under their own skies. As the plague consumed neighboring settlements, Brackenfeld endured until silence grew restless. One morning, a woman collapsed at the village fountain. Foam at her lips, her hands trembling violently. No one doubted it was the plague except Father Conrad. The village's stern, taciturn spiritual leader saw not disease, but divine punishment. He told them it was sin, not sickness, that had come. From the pulpit, his eyes alight with fire, he proclaimed, "This village is not cursed by plague, but by sin." Women unveil themselves, men work on Sundays, children sleep through sermons. And because they were afraid, and because fear silences reason, they listened. The next dawn, a woman was accused, a widow whose husband had once argued with a visiting merchant. They bound her in the square, prayers were sung, incense burned, and she died on the stones. The day after, a child. 3 days later, an elderly man. Faith was no longer petition, it was execution. Whoever cried loudest declared truth. With each sunrise, Conrad named a sinner. With every sunset, Brackenfeld sacrificed one more. And the villagers, every time, whispered, "Let this be the last." Yet every morning, the cycle repeated. One night, a young girl left a note on the church door, "You are not God." By morning, she had vanished. Conrad didn't address it, but the church door remained closed. Finally, on a Sunday, Conrad ascended the pulpit again, but no one came. Empty pews, empty faces, empty silence. For a villager lay dying, and no one saw his sin. They only grieved. They finally understood. The dead were not only victims, they were sacrificed. And the killer was not just plague, it was misplaced faith. That day, Conrad descended the pulpit and withdrew into the church's back room. He shut its door, and it never opened again. Days passed. The village fell still. The plague advanced, but the shouts had stopped. No one named another. Graves were dug. Burials occurred in silence. And one morning, the church door swung ajar. Inside, they found Conrad's body. His face was blank. His hands were clasped around his own throat, as though he wished to silence his voice forever. On the wall, Charred letters scrawled a final message. When God falls silent, those who speak become demon. That inscription remains in coal on stone Brackenfeld's vow, etched in ashes. For sometimes the greatest danger is not the disease, but the lies we believe in. In some places, death arrives quietly. In others, it sends its scent first. That sharp mixture of incense, herbs, and scorched earth spread subtly through the village with the arrival of Brunhild. The air changed when she came. No one spoke. In the village square, for those who saw her had either already lost someone or feared they were next. Brunhild looked young, but her eyes were ancient. Her hair held no gray, but her breath carried smoke. She wandered with pouches of herbs on her back and a small bowl in her hands. She entered houses without a word, left smoke behind, and departed silently. And people prayed in their hearts, "May she pass by our door." But as the plague spread, so did the whispers of Brunhild. Some called her healer, others witch, and some a soothing lie. For her incense did not cure the sickness, but it quieted the pain. The cries of the dying ceased, the grieving no longer wept. It was a kind of sleep, a kind of forgetting. One day, a mother who had buried 3 children waited at her door for Brunhild. The woman came. She entered without a word, sat quietly in the corner, lit her incense, and whispered only one thing: "If you want to remember, don't breathe this in." The mother said nothing, but the next morning, no one left the house. Some opposed Brunhild. "You fight not death, but memory," they said. But she gave no reply, for she had never fought death. She merely carried the burdens that people could no longer bear. The village priest summoned her. "You interfere with the will of God," he said. Brunhild lifted her gaze, spoke only once. "Sometimes God is too late." After that, the church emptied. People no longer sought prayers, but sleep. To be buried without pain, to die without memory, and Brunhild's smoke granted just that. But it had a cost. Her eyes grew dimmer each day. Her voice became hoarse. Her hands began to tremble, for the grief she carried began to settle into her own bones. One morning, smoke rose from a house on the highest hill. But this time, the wind shifted, and the incense drifted into every home. That morning, everyone slept deeply and did not wake for days. Brunhild was never seen again. Her house stood empty. Her bowl was shattered. But the ashes were still warm. Some still pray to her, some fear her. But all know, when grief grows too large, Brunhild's smoke will return with the wind. For some wounds never heal. They are simply forgotten. And forgetting is sometimes the heaviest cure. Sometimes, ending a story is harder than beginning one, because the end comes quietly, and every door that closes leaves a whisper behind. This is one of those whispers, the forgotten final days of a city, and of a woman whose name no one remembers. She was simply known as Agnes. When the plague surrounded the city, everyone fled. Dukes rode away in carriages, priests grabbed their holy books and escaped, and the wealthy gathered their gold and ran to mansions in the hills. But Agnes chose to stay, because when everyone leaves, someone has to close the last door. The monastery was left with only the sick. No one wanted them, not the city, not the church, not even God. Agnes stood by them alone. She laid cool claws on fevered foreheads, held trembling hands, whispered prayers after each final breath. And though no one saw it, she combed their hair, because dying wasn't the same as being forgotten. As the days passed, more beds became empty, but Agnes remained. From afar, people would say they saw a single candle burning in a high monastery window. Some said an angel remained, others a madwoman. But no one entered. One morning, the final patient took their last breath. Agnes covered them, prayed, and walked to the monastery's great wooden doors. Beyond them only wind, silence, and emptiness. But she didn't look back. She pulled the iron bar shut from the inside. And from that day forward, the door never opened again. No one saw Agnes again. Years later, the city was rebuilt. New walls, new names, new lives. But the monastery remained abandoned, because her footsteps still echoed within. And everyone knew, if someone locks a door from the inside, they have chosen to stay. As we end this story, I ask something of you. If you've made it this far, if you've heard Agnes's silence, Jonas's soil, Brunhild's smoke, and Lucas's bell ringing in your mind, please leave a like. These stories now belong to you. And maybe one day, someone else will hear them too. Subscribe, because this is not just an ending. Every last door is the beginning of another tale. The road ahead is long, and we will keep telling stories. And please, leave a comment. Your words will be carved into the stones like a whisper. Maybe someday, someone will read them, and we will not be forgotten. The plague has passed, but silence remains. And sometimes, the most lasting things are the ones never said. The Plague Diaries ends here, but as long as you remember, we will always continue to speak.